What if I told you that in the year 1493, a king became so terrified of his own shadow that he ordered it to be burned alive? What if I told you that witnesses swore they heard screaming coming not from the king himself, but from the shadow writhing in the flames? Tonight, we dive into one of history's most disturbing and forgotten tales of madness, obsession, and supernatural horror that the Vatican tried desperately to erase from all records. This is the story of King Aldrich III of Villena, monarch whose descent into madness led him to commit an act so bizarre, so utterly incomprehensible, that it challenges everything we think we know about reality itself. Our story begins in the remote kingdom of Villena, nestled in what is now the disputed border region between modern-day Slovenia and Austria. King Aldrich had ruled for 12 years when the first signs of his peculiar obsession began to manifest. Court chronicles, hidden away in monastery archives for over 5 centuries, describe how the king first noticed something wrong with his shadow during the winter solstice of 1492. According to Brother Matthias, the court scribe whose secret writings survived the purge, King Aldrich burst into the great hall during a feast, screaming that his shadow had moved independently of his body. The nobles initially dismissed this as too much wine, but what happened next chilled everyone present to the bone. The king stood perfectly still in the candlelight, and according to multiple witnesses, his shadow continued to move, gesturing frantically as if trying to communicate something urgent. But this was only the beginning of Aldrich's torment. Over the following months, the king's behavior became increasingly erratic. He refused to leave his chambers during daylight hours, claiming his shadow was growing stronger with each passing day. Palace servants reported hearing the king arguing with someone in his room. But when they entered, they found him alone, shouting at the wall where his shadow danced in the firelight. The court physician, Master Cornelius, documented symptoms that today might be recognized as severe psychological breakdown. But the medieval mind interpreted these events through a very different lens. In his private journal, Cornelius wrote that the king's shadow had begun to exhibit what he called malevolent intelligence, appearing to mock the king's movements, and sometimes moving in direct opposition to the monarch's actions. But here's where our story takes its most disturbing turn. In March of 1493, King Aldrich made a declaration that sent shockwaves through his entire kingdom. He announced that his shadow was not merely a trick of light and darkness, but a separate entity that had somehow attached itself to his soul. More terrifying still, he claimed this shadow was trying to possess him completely, to steal his body and rule the kingdom through his flesh. The king's solution to this supernatural problem would go down in history as one of the most bizarre acts ever committed by a European monarch. On the 13th day of April, 1493, King Aldrich ordered his shadow to be tried for treason, witchcraft, and attempted regicide. You heard that correctly. The king put his own shadow on trial. For 3 days, the royal court was forced to participate in this macabre legal proceeding. The shadow was assigned a defense attorney, who argued that a shadow could not be held responsible for actions beyond its control. The prosecution, led by the king himself, presented evidence of the shadow's treasonous behavior, including testimony from dozens of witnesses who claimed to have seen the shadow acting independently. The trial records, preserved in the State Archives, make for disturbing reading. Witness after witness testified to increasingly impossible events. Lady Catherine of Morven swore under oath that she had seen the king's shadow strike a servant while the king himself stood motionless. Father Benedict claimed the shadow had made obscene gestures during morning prayers while the king knelt in devout worship. On the 16th of April, the shadow was found guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by burning. Now, you might be wondering how exactly one burns a shadow. King Aldrich had spent weeks planning for this moment, consulting with scholars, alchemists, and even suspected practitioners of dark arts. The solution they devised was as ingenious as it was horrifying. A massive wooden stake was erected in the castle courtyard. But instead of binding a person to this stake, the king ordered his court magicians to create what they called a shadow trap, a complex arrangement of mirrors, candles, and polished metal surfaces designed to capture and hold his shadow in one place. On the morning of April 17, 1493, nearly 1,000 people gathered to witness the execution of a king's shadow. What happened next, according to every surviving account, defies rational explanation. King Aldric positioned himself at the center of the mirror arrangement as the sun reached its zenith. The configuration of reflective surfaces created a focal point where multiple versions of his shadow overlapped and intensified. As the king stood perfectly still, his shadow appeared darker and more solid than should have been physically possible. Then came the torches. Brother Matthias, writing in secret years later, described the moment the flames touched the shadow. According to his account, the shadow began to writhe and contort as if it were a living thing, experiencing genuine agony. But what traumatized the witnesses most was not what they saw, but what they heard. The screaming began immediately, not from King Aldric, who stood silent and motionless throughout the ordeal, but from the shadow itself. Witness after witness described hearing human cries of pain and terror emanating from the darkness, being consumed by flame. The sound was so disturbing that several nobles fainted, and many of the common folk fled the courtyard in terror. But perhaps most chilling of all was what happened to King Aldric during this impossible execution. As his shadow burned, the king himself began to change. Witnesses reported that he became increasingly pale and translucent, as if the destruction of his shadow was somehow draining the life from his body. The burning lasted for nearly 2 hours. When it was over, King Aldric collapsed to the ground, appearing almost ghost-like in the afternoon sun. He had successfully destroyed his shadow, but at a cost that would soon become apparent. For the remaining days of his life, exactly 7 days after the execution, King Aldric cast no shadow at all. He had become something that shouldn't exist. In the natural world, a person completely divorced from one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Palace servants reported that his presence felt wrong, unnatural, as if he had become something caught between life and death. More disturbing still were the king's final words. Recorded by Brother Matthias on the 24th of April, as Aldric lay dying, he whispered that burning the shadow had been a mistake. The shadow, he claimed, had not been trying to possess him. It had been trying to warn him. It had been attempting to communicate that something else, something far more malevolent, was coming for his soul. With his last breath, King Aldric screamed that he could see them now, dozens of shadows without bodies, gathering around his deathbed, ready to claim the soul of the man who had proven that shadows could die. King Aldric died that night, and with him died the kingdom of Val. Within months, the realm was absorbed by neighboring powers, and nearly every record of these events was systematically destroyed. The Catholic Church, already suspicious of anything that suggested supernatural forces beyond their control, ordered a complete suppression of the story. But some records survived, hidden in monastery libraries and private collections. These documents paint a picture of events so strange, so impossible, that historians have struggled to classify them as either elaborate fiction or genuine historical account. What makes this story even more disturbing is that similar incidents began appearing in other European courts over the following decades. Shadow-related madness, as it came to be known in certain circles, seemed to spread like a contagion among European nobility. Kings and queens across the continent began reporting strange behavior from their shadows, leading to a secret epidemic of supernatural paranoia that lasted well into the 16th century. Modern psychology might explain King Aldric's condition as a severe form of dissociative disorder or psychotic break, possibly triggered by the enormous stress of medieval kingship. The witnesses' testimonies could be attributed to mass hysteria, group psychology, or simple fabrication designed to support their monarch's delusions. But then, how do we explain the physical evidence that survived? The burn marks in the courtyard, marks that formed the exact shape of a human shadow, remain visible to this day. Chemical analysis conducted in 1997 revealed that something organic had indeed been burned in that exact spot. Something that left behind a molecular signature unlike anything in modern science. And what about the mirrors? The complex arrangement of reflective surfaces that King Aldrich used to trap his shadow was left untouched after his death. Local legends claim that on certain days, when the light hits them just right, visitors can still see a shadow moving. Within the mirrors, a shadow that gestures frantically, as if trying to communicate some urgent warning. The story of King Aldrich forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality itself. If shadows are merely the absence of light, how could one be burned? If consciousness exists only in living brains, how could a shadow scream? And if King Aldrich was simply mad, how do we explain the dozens of independent witnesses who saw and heard the impossible? Perhaps most unsettling of all is the possibility that King Aldrich wasn't mad at all. Perhaps he really did discover something about the nature of shadows that we've forgotten or chosen to ignore. Perhaps his shadow really was trying to warn him about something far worse than possession. Something that claimed his soul the moment he proved that the impossible was possible. In 1493, a king burned his shadow at the stake. Because he believed it was trying to steal his life, according to every witness present, the shadow screamed louder than any human ever could. 7 days later, the king died, and with him died one of history's most disturbing mysteries. But late at night, when you're alone with only candles for light, take a moment to watch your shadow carefully. Does it move exactly as you do? Does it respond to your every gesture without delay? And if it doesn't, if for just one moment it seems to have a will of its own, remember the fate of King Aldrich III, the man who discovered that some battles against ourselves can never truly be won. The shadow knows something we don't. The question is, are we brave enough to find out what it's trying to tell us? Or will we make the same fatal mistake as the king who burned his darkness and lost his soul? Sweet dreams.